I'm going to turn the floor back over to Frankie, and he'll start with some of the questions that we have coming in.
Thank you, Chris. One says, how is the corporate side viewing cap and trade? What seems to be the most preferred method? And then what are hang-ups on the corporate side?
From the corporate side, one thing that I didn't touch on is one major difference between cap and trade and a carbon tax is that a cap and trade system will get you certainty over how much emissions you want to. You set a cap. That's how many pieces of paper we're going to emit, and it gives you much more clarity over what that's going to be. And it relies on the market to set the price of those permits, or how much you're going to have to pay in order to pollute. And you can't tell ahead of time. If the economy speeds up, there might be a lot of competition for those permits, and the price will go up. If the economy slows down like it is now, emissions are going to start to slow naturally because economic activity is down. Permits might cost a lot less. So for a lot of businesses, frankly, they would prefer something with a little bit more price stability so that they know if they're making a major investment in low-carbon technology, that it'll actually be worthwhile. I had a very strange encounter. I don't think I can say with who, but I went to a meeting between a labor union and its employer, the major industrial sector represented, a major carbon energy user and carbon emitter, sort of concerned about this stuff. This is around the Lieberman-Warner bill. They were so concerned about it, they actually asked the labor union if they would come out publicly opposed to the Lieberman-Warner bill in support of command and control regulation in its place, for the sole reason that they wanted the regulatory certainty. They had a huge exposure to carbon risk, and so they were very concerned about the price. A carbon tax doesn't tell you exactly how much pollution you're going to get, but it does set the price with some relative certainty, and for a lot of businesses, that's a big deal. You can't have both. You can't have certainty over price and emissions, and to be perfectly honest, the reason why carbon taxes aren't really moving is because they're called carbon taxes. And it's very, very difficult to find support for something that's called a tax. It's just that that word is just poison around here. So the business that I've talked to would appreciate some kind of stability in the carbon price, which you get through a carbon tax. You can modify a cap and trade system to give it less volatility on the price side, to make it look more like a carbon tax. The political risk is the more that it looks like a carbon tax, the more people are going to call it a carbon tax or an energy tax or something other equal, some other term equally distasteful to voters, and that can scotch the whole deal. So it's a balancing act, but I think from the economists almost universally prefer a carbon tax because of the certainty issue. But we're less concerned with hitting emissions targets in any one given year than we are about sending consistent and appropriate price signals to the economy.
We actually had a number of questions related to that. One of them is from Emily. There's some economic support for a carbon tax as more effective market-based means to reduce emissions. Is this out of the question from a regulatory perspective in the U.S.? There's another one. Secretary Chu recently said in an interview that he and the president are not talking about a carbon tax, meaning it's not being considered as a viable option at that level of the administration. Why do you think a carbon tax has taken such a back seat to cap and trade? Do you see any chance that a carbon tax will be adopted? And then there's another one. What do you feel are the pros and cons of a carbon tax? And why is it not getting any traction compared to cap and trade? It seems like it would require much less infrastructure for measuring, monitoring, and allocating, require fewer large emitters to be involved at the source.
Right. Just to start things off, someone asked about the chances of a carbon tax. I give a carbon tax roughly a 0% chance of going anywhere, give or take 5%. That word is just not conceivable in this current Congress configuration. And by the way, under no configuration that I foresee in the next 4 years. An energy tax is just too much politically. It's just too big of a political lift. You'll notice that the opponents of the cap and trade legislation have taken it to calling it a carbon tax. If they successfully eliminate the distinction between a cap and trade system and a carbon tax, then we could conceivably get a carbon tax. It'll take some time to do that, but far more likely they'll destroy, they'll try to destroy the popular support for that bill, and we'll end up with something coming through the EPA. The EPA cannot levy a carbon tax. The power to raise money in those volumes can only come from technically actually from the House of Representatives. The Senate's not even allowed to do that. The politics are just that difficult. Whoever's comment was about the benefits of how much easier a carbon tax would be, they're absolutely correct. The failure of the European carbon system, they have a cap and trade system. The big failure there was that they gave all the permits away for free, or 99% of them, I think. And to find out how many to give out and to whom, they asked polluters how much they polluted last year and used that to base their allocation decision for the following year. And while you can't prove that any one firm lied, looking back on the system now, it's obvious that probably all of them did, to be perfectly honest. It's a utility-only, electricity generator-only system, so it's only the utilities to be concerned about. But after 6 months of the system, they had their mid-year, sort of what they call a truing up, where you can start submitting your permits halfway through the year if you want to. You don't have to, but you can. They found they had given out far too many permits, and that while permit prices had been in the neighborhood of, I think, 40 euros a ton, overnight they crashed to about €1 a ton because they realized that the government gave out, I can't remember what the target was. If the government's target was 10 tons, they probably gave out something in the neighborhood of 15 tons worth of permits for free based on this bad data that they got. With a carbon tax, you don't have to ask that question. You just say, yeah, if you want to pollute, you got to pay the tax. And we can track the carbon pretty well through energy flows. So we do that pretty well already. So it's not that difficult to determine who's buying what fuel and therefore how much carbon is coming out and what their tax burden ought to be. If you get permits away in any significant volume, you're going to have the same problem that the Europeans did. You're going to have to find out how many permits you're supposed to give out. If you sell them all, then you really don't care what happened last year. You just say, whoever wants a permit, come to the auction window, put in your bid and buy as many as you can at that price, or wait for the secondary market to develop. But the politics are just too ugly around the word tax.
Jim, we have time for just one more question. What is the likelihood that Waxman and Markey will make so many concessions to get the necessary number of votes for passage of their bill that the approved process is completely ineffective at actually reducing overall greenhouse gas emissions?
There's a very good chance that happens. The problem with cap and trade, with carbon legislation right now, if you're a Democrat, I should say, I work both sides of the aisle, the Democrats and Republicans, but this is obviously a Democratic thing. If you're the Democrats trying to get this done, your problem right now is not the Republican Party. Your problem right now is the Democratic Party, specifically the Democrats who do not come from the coast. The broad swath, the middle of the country is very hesitant. They're very nervous, being old manufacturing states. So the Democrats dominate this Energy and Commerce Committee, but that doesn't mean that they dominate this vote. So to get it out of that committee, to save his face, Waxman will probably sort of hold his nose and do whatever it takes to win this vote, either by a margin of 1 or with 100% Democratic backing, or somewhere pretty close to the 2. If he can't get unanimity, then he'll go for a bare victory, and whichever is going to cost him less, and whichever is going to be easier to get to, he's going to go for. Because I think politically he really has to get something out of this committee, or this horribly ugly fight that he had with Mr. Dingell at no cost, at some cost to himself, will all have been a waste of time. To reiterate, since it can't pass the Senate no matter what at the moment, I've been telling people for a long time now that this is, unfortunately, this one is another dry run this is another dress rehearsal for this bill, because the Senate is still a blockade. I think we could move a couple of the essential votes after the next election, depending on how that turns out. But right now, they're still, they still don't have the 60 votes they need to move it. So, in a large sense, it doesn't matter for the environment what happens with Mr. Waxman's bill.
That's all the time we have today, everybody. Thank you, Jim and Chris, for sharing your perspectives, and thank you to our audience for attending. If you're interested in learning more about how Climate Earth can help your organization, please do visit our brand new website at climateearth.com. Thank you, everybody. Goodbye.